At 6 a.m. local time, USS Lincoln, CVN-72, Nimitz-class nuclear carrier, $13 billion including the air wing, is 40 nautical miles south of the Strait of Hormuz. Call sign, Lincoln Actual. The carrier strike group is in standard transit formation, 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers forward, 1 Ticonderoga cruiser to port, 1 destroyer to starboard, 2 more trailing. 6 escorts, billions in Aegis radar. P-8 Poseidons orbiting overhead with full sonobuoy loads, the most capable anti-submarine warfare package the U.S. Navy can deploy. None of it is designed for what is waiting on the seafloor 40 miles ahead. Here is the math. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, 21 nautical miles. Strip away the designated shipping lanes, the channels that 200 commercial tankers use every single day, and the navigable corridor for a carrier strike group compresses to roughly 6 nautical miles of open water. That is the entire playable space. And inside that space, the seafloor in multiple locations sits between 9 and 12 meters deep. Meters, not fathoms, meters. Shallower than a 4-story building is tall. A Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine, the most capable attack boat the U.S. Navy operates, needs a minimum of 27 meters of water to maneuver safely. In the shallow approaches to Hormuz, a Virginia-class cannot dive to evade. It cannot run a sprint and drift evasion profile. It is a $3.4 billion fish in a puddle. So the Navy left the Virginia-class home. Iran has known this for 20 years. Iran built a weapon specifically around this gap. The weapon is called the Ghadir. And before we go further, stop for a second. Lincoln Actual is approaching the choke point. Somewhere on the seafloor ahead, up to 23 of these submarines may be sitting completely still, silent, waiting. The P-8 Poseidons have been dropping sonobuoys for 2 hours. They have found nothing. What do you think happens next? A. The P-8s locate the threat before Lincoln reaches the corridor, and the strike group transits clean. B. One Ghadir lifts off the bottom, fires both torpedoes at under 4,000 yards, and is back on the seabed before any escort can respond. C. A third option, something in the U.S. Navy's toolkit that changes the geometry in a way most people do not know exists. Drop A, B, or C in the comments. Or write what you think the correct defensive move is. We will show you in a few minutes whether the U.S. Navy's answer matches yours. Now, the Ghadir. The Ghadir-class is a North Korean-designed, Iranian-built midget submarine. It displaces 120 tons submerged. That is lighter than a fully loaded semi-truck at highway weight. It is 29 meters long, shorter than a commercial Boeing 737. Construction cost per hull, approximately $5 million. Iran currently operates 23 of them. 23 Ghadirs. At $5 million each, that is $115 million for the entire fleet. Total, the USS Lincoln cost $4.5 billion to build. Add the air wing, the FA-18 Super Hornets, the E-2D Hawkeyes, the ordnance, the maintenance pipeline, and the fully operational number lands between $12 and $13 billion. One carrier, one target. Cost ratio, $115 million versus $13 billion. That is a 113-to-1 advantage in Iran's favor before a single torpedo leaves a tube. The American taxpayer just found out what the worst trade in naval history looks like on paper. But cost asymmetry is only half the equation. The Ghadir's real weapon is not the torpedo. It is the physics of where it hides. Battery electric propulsion. No diesel engine running at speed. No nuclear reactor circulating coolant fluid through pumps. No exhaust signature. When a Ghadir sits motionless on the seafloor with its crew on low-power protocol, minimum life support, no active electronics, crew at rest, it emits less acoustic signature than a fishing trawler riding at anchor. The passive sonar systems on Lincoln's escorts, the TB-37 multifunction towed arrays, the SQS-53C hull-mounted sonar, were designed to track Soviet nuclear submarines in the deep North Atlantic. Submarines that had to keep reactors running. Submarines that had to move. A Ghadir that is not moving in water so shallow that ambient noise from surface shipping saturates every frequency band below 500 hertz. is acoustically invisible to those systems. The P-8 Poseidon is the most capable maritime patrol aircraft the United States operates. It carries the AN/ASQ-508 magnetic anomaly detection system. MAD works in water deep enough that a submerged hull has open water beneath it, where the magnetic distortion of the steel hull registers cleanly against the geological baseline. In 10 meters of water, with a sandy, metallic mineral seabed and 200 steel-hulled tankers passing overhead every day, the magnetic signature of a 120-ton submarine blends into the noise floor. The sonobuoy pattern the P-8 crews flew this morning covered 3/4 of the transit corridor. What they heard? Tankers. What they could not hear? What was not making sound? Here is the part that does not add up on the surface. Iran does not need the Ghadir to win a battle. Iran needs the Ghadir to make the entry price unacceptable. The Ghadir carries 2 U-3 torpedoes. The U-3 is a Chinese-designed weapon produced under Iranian license. It is a wake-homing torpedo, which means it does not track the carrier's hull with active sonar. It tracks the wake, the turbulence left by the propeller shafts in the water astern of a ship moving at speed. A carrier making 15 knots leaves a wake signature that persists in the water column for 4 to 6 minutes. The U-3, once it acquires that wake, follows it home. It does not need a firing solution measured in meters. It does not need to see the hull. It needs the carrier to be moving. Effective engagement range, inside 4,000 yards. The navigable corridor through Hormuz's narrowest section, roughly 12,000 yards wide. A Ghadir positioned near the center of the shipping channel, firing at a perpendicular angle to the carrier's track, has geometry that is almost trivially simple to execute. Now picture it from the other side. On the seafloor 9 meters below the surface, in water barely deep enough to cover the Ghadir's sail, a crew of 18 has been lying still for 4 days. The temperature inside the hull is 34 degrees Celsius. The CO2 scrubbers are running on minimum power. The command to move has not come. They listen. They hear the tanker traffic as a continuous wall of low-frequency noise. They hear the distant turn of Lincoln's escorts, propeller cavitation, the particular frequency signature of an Arleigh Burke at 15 knots. The bearing drifts slowly left as the formation moves north. The geometry opens. The order comes. The crew has 90 seconds. Lift off the bottom, 8 seconds of motor current. The hull rises 2 meters off the sediment, enough to fire without seabed back pressure on the tubes. Targeting solution fed, 0 computation required. Wake is at bearing 010, range 3,600 yards, speed 14 knots. Both tubes flood. Fire 1. 4-second interval. Fire 2. The Ghadir drops back to the bottom. Active electronics off. Crew silent. 93 seconds from first motion to hull back on sediment. The escorts cannot depth charge. Not because they lack the weapons. Every Arleigh Burke carries Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes and ASROC rocket-propelled depth charges. Because there are 200 commercial tankers in the strait on any given day. Vessels from Japan, South Korea, India, China, Singapore, the UAE. A Mk-54 detonated at shallow depth in the Hormuz shipping channel does not distinguish between a 120-ton Iranian submarine and a 300,000-ton Panamanian-flagged crude carrier. The U.S. Navy cannot fire into that traffic. Iran built its doctrine around the global economy as a shield and the geometry of international commerce as a legal sanctuary. What strikes me most about this is that Iran published it. The Ghadir force posture, bottom sitting, battery silent, 2 torpedo minimum engagement, 90-second attack cycle, appears in Iranian naval doctrine documents that are not classified. This is intentional. Iran wants the carrier group commander to know exactly what is down there, because knowing the threat and having a credible answer to it are 2 entirely separate problems. The hull of USS Lincoln is 333 meters long. It displaces 104,000 tons fully loaded. A single U-3 torpedo impact does not cause catastrophic loss against a hull that size. But a U-3 wake-homing detonation against the aft quarter, specifically the propeller shafts, the rudder assembly, the shaft seals, does not need to sink the ship. It needs to render it unable to maneuver. Flight operations on a carrier require a minimum of 30 knots of wind over the deck. That wind comes from the ship moving and turning into the wind. No propulsion, no flight operations. No flight operations, no air wing. The $13 billion asset becomes a very large, very expensive platform that cannot do its one job. Mission kill timeline, 18 months of dry dock, minimum. The USS Cole, a destroyer, 1/7 the displacement, was mission killed by a 300-kilogram waterline blast and required 14 months of repair. A propulsion system hit on a Nimitz-class would exceed that, during which the Lincoln is in a repair yard, not in the Persian Gulf, not projecting power, and the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. $13 billion, mission killed by $5 million, and a torpedo that costs less than a new car. Lincoln Actual is now 18 nautical miles from the corridor entrance. The carrier group commander has 3 options, and every one of them is a bad trade. Option 1, transit on schedule with active sonar flooding the corridor. The MH-60R Seahawks and the destroyer line run active pinging across the full 6-mile band. It is the most thorough ASW screen available. It is also the loudest possible announcement of Lincoln's exact position, speed, and track to every Iranian sensor within 50 nautical miles. Active sonar is a flashlight in a dark room. It illuminates what is there. It also tells everything in the room exactly where you are. Option 2, delay the transit. A carrier that stops short of Hormuz because of a threat it cannot confirm is a carrier that has already surrendered the objective. Iran does not need to fire a single torpedo to win that outcome. The Ghadir wins by existing, by making the entry costs look wrong on a risk calculus spreadsheet. Option 3, find the tool that was built for this environment. Not a Virginia-class, not a P-8. Something the Navy retired because, at the time, the Cold War made it seem unnecessary. The diesel-electric SSK, a conventional submarine running on batteries, no reactor, near-zero acoustic signature, able to operate in the same 10-meter water column where the Ghadir sits. A diesel-electric boat in the Hormuz approaches does not need to run propulsion continuously. It sits. It listens with a hull-mounted passive sonar designed for shallow coastal water. And when a Ghadir lifts off the bottom to execute its 90-second attack cycle, the SSK hears it, because in the 8 seconds between the Ghadir leaving the sediment and the first torpedo clearing the tube, the battery motor current and the flooding sequence create a distinct transient signature that is, briefly, the loudest thing in 6 nautical miles of otherwise quiet water. The U.S. Navy retired its last diesel-electric submarine, USS Blueback, SS-581, in October 1990. The reasoning was sound for 1990. Nuclear submarines have unlimited endurance. They do not surface to recharge. They are faster over long distances. For Cold War deterrence patrols in the deep North Atlantic, the logic holds. For hunting bottom-sitting 120-ton midget submarines in 10 meters of water in the Persian Gulf, it does not. The 2 missions require different tools. The Navy made a bet in 1990 that shallow water anti-submarine warfare would not be the defining challenge of the next 30 years. Iran noticed. Here is the take that will probably draw some pushback. The Ghadir threat is not fundamentally a military failure. It is a procurement failure repeated across 4 administrations. The shallow water ASW gap was identified in studies commissioned in the late 1990s. The recommended solutions, maintaining a limited U.S. diesel-electric submarine force, or establishing formal integration agreements with Germany, Australia, or Japan, all of whom operate modern SSKs optimized for coastal operations, were reviewed, assessed as valid, and shelved. Not because the threat analysis was wrong, because the budget case was harder to make than the strategic case was to ignore. You had a quiet threat requiring a capability that the Navy's nuclear submarine community had no institutional interest in advocating for. Most people assume that a Navy spending more than $200 billion annually on procurement would have closed this gap by now. It has not. The gap exists, has been documented for decades, and the Ghadir fleet has grown from an initial batch to 23 operational hulls while the studies continued. Put yourself in the acquisition office in 2003. You have a study on your desk. It says the Navy needs diesel-electric submarines for shallow water anti-submarine warfare in the Persian Gulf. You also have 2 active wars, a defense budget under simultaneous pressure from the Army and Air Force, and 3 flag officers who want more Virginia-class hulls. You table the study. 20 years later, 23 Ghadirs are on the seafloor of the Strait of Hormuz, and a carrier group is making entry decisions based on a threat the 2003 study said was coming. What would you have done? 2 MH-60R Seahawks, call signs Ranger 11 and Ranger 12, are off the deck of USS Howard, forward of the carrier group. The MH-60R carries the AQS-22 Airborne Low-Frequency Sonar, ALFS, a dunking sonar system that the crew deploys by lowering the transducer on a cable while the helicopter hovers at low altitude and low airspeed. ALFS is effective in water as shallow as 15 meters when conditions cooperate. In 10 meters of water with tanker traffic overhead, the acoustic environment is still chaotic, but it is the best active ASW tool the Navy operates for this depth band. And it is something the original Ghadir doctrine did not fully weight. Ranger 11 contact, bearing 270, 800 meters from dip point, small return, 4-second transient, seabed inconsistency. Ranger 11 holds the contact. It is not conclusive. Small magnetic variance, not sustained. Could be geology, could be debris, could be a 120-ton submarine crew that just adjusted its trim by half a meter. The carrier group commander has 90 seconds to decide before Lincoln crosses the 12,000-yard line. 3 miles south of the planned track, slower. Inside the shallow water zone for an additional 22 minutes. Fuel expenditure for the escorts, elevated. But away from the Ranger contact, with Ranger 11 positioned between the contact bearing and the carrier's new track. The call goes out. Lincoln actual, alter course 180, reduce speed to 12, Ranger element holds current pattern. It is not a clean answer. It is the kind of answer that does not appear in budget justifications. It is a commander using the tools available, not the tools the doctrine anticipated needing, to cover a gap that should have been closed in 2003. Lincoln transits. The contact on Ranger 11's ALFS plot fades after 11 minutes. Whether that was a Ghadir crew that heard the active dip and went back to minimum power, or a geological feature that read ambiguous for 20 minutes and then resolved, the after-action will debate for months. The assessment team will not reach a definitive conclusion. That ambiguity is itself part of Iran's doctrine. A threat that cannot be confirmed cannot be prosecuted, and a threat that cannot be prosecuted cannot be removed. Here is what this tells us about where naval power projection actually stands. The most expensive military machine in human history is, in a 6 nautical mile corridor 21 miles wide, genuinely held at risk by a 29-meter steel tube that costs less than a Manhattan studio apartment. That is not rhetoric. That is an engineering equation. And the equation does not improve because the Lincoln is impressive. It improves when the gap closes. The British learned this in the Falklands. In shallow coastal water, operating far from home bases, with no diesel-electric submarines available for the specific threat environment, HMS Sheffield went dark from a single exocet. Shallow water vulnerability is not a new discovery. The failure to address it is a policy choice, not a capability gap. We showed you the Ghadir in the context of the mine warfare problem in an earlier video. What we did not show you was the torpedo half of the equation. Now you have both. The next question, and we are going to answer it, is what a modern diesel-electric SSK actually costs to field, how long it takes to get one into the strait, and which allied navies already have the hull type the U.S. Navy would need to borrow tomorrow if the order came down tonight. Subscribe to Navy Powerline, because the answer to that question does not come from a press release. It comes from the math, and the math is what we show you. Comment AIP below if you want the next video to cover Iran's air-independent propulsion upgrade program for the second-generation Ghadir. That is the version that changes the timeline from 5 days of bottom sitting to 14. And the timeline is everything.